It's been a while, but welcome back to Kenpo. We're going to do a sort of longer form video today that has two parts. First part with short form one, second part with long form one. In the beginning of Kenpo, because it derives from the sort of hardstyle karate forms, there was just the kata. And you would learn all of the techniques that you needed from the kata. You're practicing a particular mode of engaging with your martial art and engaging with your opponent. So I'm going back to that kind of forms taught modality, and what that requires us to do, what it encourages us to do, is to take some time and really think about the movements. This is a very careful kind of practice. In our other videos we talked about blocking and how to connect that to your center, how to step back with your center. We're going to put that all together now by using our center to think about the different kinds of blocks that are in short form one, and then their purpose as is demonstrated in long form one. Let's start with our outward blocks in short form one. The inward blocks are weird because we begin from a horse stance. If we've done our second inward block in short form one and we're moving up to our outward block, as we do this, I want you to think about the rotation that we're doing. Are we doing direct or counter rotation? So our center is moving around this direction and our block is moving around that direction. It's direct rotation. Our first outward block then is an outward block with direct rotation. The second outward block, think about the way that your center is moving as you move back and block. Move up a little bit. So my center is moving that way, and my block is moving that way. That makes it counter rotation. In essence, then we have two different outward blocks in short form one. We have one with direct rotation, one with counter rotation. And if you go through the kata, you'll see that you have that for all of the blocks. I adjust over, my center is moving away from my upward block. I move back, my center is moving into my upward block. I adjust up, my center is moving into my downward block. I step back, it's moving away from my downward block. And then you do it on the left side and you match all those blocks. You have a left and right direct rotation, left and right counter rotation. Great, you say. Now I know a completely arbitrary fact about short form one and blocking. What's the point? Ultimately, as with everything in Kenpo, we're aiming for how do we use this. So let's think just about the block right now and think about our self-defense techniques. We'll go with a downward block. For something like thrusting salute, we have a movement with our downward block that's a direct rotation into the rest of the technique. We'll talk about the rest of it after we do long form one. Or for something like hugging pendulum, we have motion away from our downward block. We have counter rotation on something like shielding hammer. My center is moving away from my outward block. We have direct rotation on something like calming the storm, moving with it, or securing the storm, also moving with it. So we're going to have to ask ourselves, what's the point? Why do we use one of those versus another? To really get to that who cares part, we're going to have to look at long form one. Now I have to preface this by saying this is not how you should do the form in a tournament or even in daily practice in front of Master Halsey or whoever's leading the class. This is a thought experiment. How does the form look if we're paying very close attention to whether we're moving with or against our block? I'm going to face this direction for my inward block so that I can turn and see you when I do my outward block. If we want to think about that first outward block with direct rotation into it in long form one, our next move is to punch. If our center is already moving in that direction, there's no need for a 1, 2 count. We can instead think about that as a block and a punch with the same rotational energy. On the other block, where we're moving away from it, there has to be a 1, 2. We can't move back with our center rotating this way and punch at the same time. So we have a different timing. One of them is 1 and, the other one is 1, 2. Let's talk for a second about hip motion. As we discussed in our first two videos, we want everything to be connected through our core. So there are two ways to do this. One of which is a sort of vibration with our hip, and the other is a direct generation of force. The direct generation of force, my hand starts a little bit early, my hip begins to rotate, everything comes together, driving all at once. The other option is this kind of vibrating. So I'm launching through my foot through my knee, squeezing in with my inner thigh muscles, through my hip, into my shoulder, and then launching my punch from there. So this is not a huge motion that's ultimately disconnected. That's pushing from the ground, generating all the force, using that hip to throw my hand. To practice this, let's do some center punches from a horse stance. So one of those ways can look like that, where my hand begins and then my hip drives the force forward. And the other way can look like this, where my hip launches my hand. Driving, launching. If you want to think self-defense techniques, and kind of apologies, I'm jumping all over the lists here. Anytime we have that plant turn, something like clutching feathers, that's a kind of launching strike. 1, 2. That has to come from your hip, launching your hand. And then a lot of the times where we have something with a shuffle, that's going to be that sort of driving strike. So thundering hammers, 1, everything moving together into that strike. The real reason this matters is, as with everything, power generation. Where are we finding tension that we can then release? Kenpo's at a disadvantage here because we're missing a stance called the back stance or hokutsutachi. So that looks like a Kenpo neutral bow, and then we turn our foot out to 90 degrees, we sit back into it, and we turn our front foot forward. It's not a useful stance for fighting. You would not want to fight from here. It's a really useful training stance. Because if you sit in this stance with me, you can feel all of this tension in your back hip, especially if you sit properly into it. You don't want your hips sideways, you want what we call hanmi, which is basically our neutral bow position. You can feel all of that tension in this back leg. So we can imagine that we have a bow and really stretch out, feel all that tension building in our back hip for a driving punch forward or a launching punch forward. Think about our second block punch, where we build that tension in our back hip and our glute and then vibrate into our punch, as essentially the same as sitting in this hokutsutachi back stance, extending that and then driving forward. The other thing we don't do in Kenpo is we don't stand in one place with a strike already out and then try to strike without shifting our stance. If you do that, you have to engage your back hip as that sort of vibrating to generate power. Otherwise, you're just doing this, which I'm sure you've seen at tournaments, but it should be powerful every time with that vibration of your hip. We can apply that to the second half of the kata, where we do these triple blocks, which I'm sure you have all seen and probably done as a sort of series of disconnected arm movements, which may as well be anything. So instead, let's ask, what if we thought about the second block and the tension that builds up? I feel it in this hip, I feel it in my rear glute, and if I release that tension, it makes for a much more explosive block. So perhaps Long Form 1 is saying, hey, every time you block, it should build up that tension in your hip and your glute, and you should stretch it and release it. So even when you're doing short form 1, it shouldn't be just arm motions, but it should be this engagement of your core, this building up of tension that launches your blocks. Which you can only do if you step back in that connected kind of way we talked about. And then we get to the end. Or we think about using our hip vibration to launch every one of these strikes in a kind of increasing tension. That should really, really, really pull back here so I can release it into the other direction. So I can release it into the other direction. Great, you say. So now I know how to do long form 1, like I'm a hard stylist. How does that help black gi wearing street application Kenpo practitioner that I am? If we think through our self-defense techniques, we find these places where we could probably be generating more power if we paid attention to that tension and release. Let's go all the way back to yellow belt. Attacking mace. When we step back and block, we're building all of this tension in our hip as though we're in hokutsutachi, exploding into zenkutsudachi. So instead, we're in our neutral bow, but we still build that tension. We squeeze in with our inner thigh muscles, we engage our core, and we drive forward into that punch, which generates so much more power than if we are disconnected or even just sort of sitting neutral over our stance. And one of the things that makes Kenpo so good is that we gradually build more and more of these tensions into our techniques. So we start with attacking mace, we do one big tension, one big release, and then the follow-up. We move to our, say, orange belt, everyone's favorite 5 swords. This is a technique that's all about building tension. I can feel that stretch in my back hip, so I can release that tension forward. Now I can feel it here and in my glutes, so I can release that forward. And I can even think about that on that plant turn or that rotation that we have here. Where do I feel that tension that I can build up here and release out this direction? So we see this repeatedly throughout the system. Parting wings, tension, 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 or any of those rotating techniques is all about shifting that tension from one hip to the other.